This episode is brought to you by Netflix. Jay Kelly, the new film from Academy Award nominee Noah Baumbach. George Clooney stars as an actor confronting his past and present on a journey of self-discovery, alongside Adam Sandler as his devoted manager. Critics are calling it a declaration of love to the chaotic art of filmmaking, with the Wall Street Journal praising it as a transcendent comedy drama. Jay Kelly is now playing only on Netflix.
Introducing Meta Ray-Ban Display, the world's most advanced AI glasses. With a full color display built into the lens of the glasses, it's there when you need it and gone when you don't. Send and receive messages, translate or caption live conversations, collaborate with Meta AI, and more. Be one of the first to try Meta Ray-Ban Display. Visit meta.com/Meta Ray-Ban Display to book a demo and find your pair.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to a special bonus episode of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. A lot of research and preparation goes into making each episode of Ben Franklin's World, and in this respect, episode 193 was no different. That's the episode I called Partisans, the friendship and rivalry of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Now, episode 193 came about because you asked me for an episode about the relationship between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. So, as I set to work thinking about how I might cover this topic, I had a few ideas. One option could have been to seek out an interview with one of the many historians who has written about this relationship. It's a tried and true technique and one I use all the time here on this show. But a chance meeting while I stood in my Omohundro Institute office presented me with a different option. So, one of the interesting things about my OI office is that it contains extra copies of all the different books the Institute has published since 1947. And sitting right there on one of the bookshelves were a couple of copies of Lester Cappon's The Adams-Jefferson Letters. So I picked up one of these volumes, I flipped it open, I started reading, and then I couldn't really put it down. Lester Cappon's The Adams-Jefferson Letters was published in 1959, and it was the first book to offer readers all 380 letters written between John and Abigail Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Now, I know what you're thinking. 380 letters sounds like a lot of letters, and it is. But Cappon separated these letters into 13 chapters, and at the start of each chapter, he offered a short introductory essay that placed me in a particular time and place in the lives of both the Adamses and Thomas Jefferson. So, on the whole, I found myself reading and enjoying Cappon's volume, not just because of the lively writing of the Adamses and Jefferson, but because, as a whole, the letters and introductory essays made the volume read like a great story. So Cappon's story about this relationship, which he offered mostly through the actual letters the Adamses wrote to Jefferson and vice versa, became the story I wanted to share with you. But since Lester Cappon died in 1981, I called upon other documentary editors to get you a similar story, the relationship between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson as the two men saw it. So now I offer you this bonus episode, which I like to think of as a companion piece to episode 193 because I just couldn't stop thinking about the Adams-Jefferson letters and how masterfully Cappon put them together. So this curiosity led me to do something I normally do, which is to find a source and pose lots of questions to it. In this case, I went to the director of the Omohundro Institute, Karin Wulf, and asked her to tell me more about Lester Cappon, his edited volume, and the OI's participation in the world of documentary editing. And that conversation led to this special bonus episode, a behind-the-scenes look at the work of the Omohundro Institute and Lester Cappon's groundbreaking documentary edition, The Adams-Jefferson Letters. So, during our backstage tour, Karin reveals a brief history of the Omohundro Institute and its mission, why the OI and Lester Cappon undertook the work to produce the Adams-Jefferson Letters, and details about all the work that goes into producing a documentary edition. All right. Are you ready for our backstage tour of the Omohundro Institute? Let's go meet our expert guide.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is a historian of early America and a professor of history at William & Mary. She's a specialist in the history of women, gender, and political culture in 18th century British America, and she's the director of the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture. Today, she joins us to discuss some of the history of the Omohundro Institute by helping us explore its work to publish the first edition of the Complete Correspondence between John and Abigail Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Welcome back to Ben Franklin's World, Karin Wulf.
Thanks so much, Liz. It's great to be here.
You know, the name Omohundro Institute is something we hear quite often because Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute, so I say it all the time in the show. But what exactly is it, Karin? Would you tell us a bit about the history and mission of this organization?
So that's a great question. And you know how this is, Liz. If you ask a historian a question, you might be in for a very long answer, but I'll try to be succinct because I think the Omohundro Institute's history is in many ways the history of why and how we understand early America. So the OI was founded formally in 1943, but it was actually the product of discussions in the early 20th century among historians who thought that American history was super focused on the post-Civil War period, kind of understandable. The Civil War was an awfully big event. And in the wake of it, there was a lot of grappling to try to understand why the war had happened and also to understand its aftermath. But this group of historians thought that it was incredibly important to understand the earlier period as well. And there were actually a variety of different places that they thought that an institute focused on research and publication in early American history could be located. So they were sort of looking at different places, New York and Philadelphia. I have to say this was a very East Coast biased sort of exploration. But in any case, after World War II, there was a lot of interest in Williamsburg. The Rockefellers had invested in founding Colonial Williamsburg. And at the time, Colonial Williamsburg was very focused also on doing research into early America. And the College of William & Mary had a publication program with a journal, the William & Mary Quarterly. So the Institute of Early American History and Culture came to Williamsburg in 1943. And since 1943, the OI, with its founding sponsor, the College of William & Mary, has been focused on expert research and publication in early America. I would say that the OI's mission in some ways hasn't really changed since the 1940s. We're celebrating our 75th anniversary this year, which is really exciting. On that mission to support scholars and scholarship and then to share that scholarship as widely as possible with a real conviction that early America is foundational history, that hasn't changed. What I think maybe has changed is that East Coast bias. That is that we think of early America now not as the kind of British colonies on the East Coast of North America, but we think of early America as the broadest sense of North America and the Atlantic, the Caribbean. We think about the broadest context in which early America was situated. But that's a short history of an actually long and complicated institutional history.
But it is a really interesting and fascinating history to dive into because when you go back into the Omohundro Institute's history, you find all sorts of neat connections with historical scholarship and what we know about the past. And just to give us one example here, the OI was behind the publication of Lester Cappon's The Adams-Jefferson Letters. And when I conducted my research for episode 193, which was about the friendship and rivalry of Adams and Jefferson, I found that Cappon's volume was the first time that anyone could read all the letters that the Adamses and Thomas Jefferson ever wrote to one another. And so that volume was really helpful to me, and I now have to wonder, what drove the Omohundro Institute to undertake that project?
Well, I think part of that has to do with Lester Cappon, the editor, and he's really important to that story. Lester Cappon was part of a generation of scholars who worked at the Institute and who published through the Institute, who were trained simultaneously as archivists and as historians, and really believed that producing strong documentary editions of historical manuscripts was an important way to share the early American past with the broader public, as well as to make more information available for more histories to be written. So Lester Cappon was really the driving force behind the Adams-Jefferson correspondence volumes. But it wasn't actually the first documentary edition that the Institute published, even that early on. The Institute's first book, in fact, was an edition of a historical manuscript. It was an edition of Robert Beverley's 1705 History of Virginia. So the OI was already in the business, even in this early period, of producing edited historical manuscripts.
What exactly is a documentary edition? It's something you've mentioned a couple times now, and I wonder if you would tell us what one looks like and how we might use it.
So a documentary edition is a historical manuscript that has then been published after some careful editing and scholarly work by skilled, trained staff. So every single piece of that long sentence probably could use some unpacking. But what it really means is taking a historical manuscript, whether it was written in manuscript or now, things are created on screens or they were created in typewriters in the 20th century, but taking that historical document and reproducing the text with a lot of explanation around it and then sharing it more widely. And what I mean by the explanation around it is that obviously you can't simply reproduce the manuscript letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to John Adams. I guess you could produce a kind of facsimile of it so that people would open a volume or look on screen and simply see the handwriting. But it's hard to read that way, and it's hard to search that way. It's hard to index that way, so it makes it harder to use for historians. So documentary editors produce that text in usable text and then also put explanatory apparatus around it. They do a lot of annotating. So they explain, for example, when Adams is writing something specific to Jefferson and makes a reference that perhaps a modern reader might not understand, or there is a context which even a historian might find useful to understand, they annotate that text. It's the notes at the bottom of the page or sometimes at the back of the volume. So documentary editing requires selection of the material, preparation of the material, and then putting apparatus around it. Now, I'm not a documentary editor, although I have worked on 2 editions myself of 18th century historical manuscripts, but I wasn't trained as a documentary editor. And I know that you will have just had the opportunity to talk to 2 of the most skilled documentary editors working today about this very volume. And I'm sure that they'll be able to provide a little more expert input. But as a consumer and as a kind of less trained producer of documentary editions, that's kind of the basic. You choose, you prepare, and then you create the framework around it.
I wonder if you would tell us a bit more about Lester Cappon's editorial process specifically. As I mentioned, I used the Adams-Jefferson Letters a great deal to produce episode 193. And I wonder, what are some of the things that we could look for that might show us Cappon's handiwork or skill as an editor when we open that volume?
Well, I think what would be really interesting to do is, you could literally open the volume at any page and pick any one of the letters and see how Cappon decided to create a headnote, for example, that explains the context of the book. I'm actually opening one of the first volumes right now, although modern readers will know the Adams-Jefferson Letters as a single volume publication. It was actually first published as 2 volumes, which itself is kind of interesting to know, but I'm just looking at random. I happen to open the first volume here, and I'm looking at a page where there is a letter from Jefferson to Adams when he's in Paris in 1785. And you can see what Cappon decided to annotate in that letter. What he chooses to annotate there is that Jefferson is giving Adams some context around treaty business with Portugal. And the annotation explains who some of the references are in the letter. He describes this man, the Count de Souza, who is the Portuguese ambassador at Versailles at the time. So that's a choice that Cappon had to make about what information in this particular letter would be essential, even for a historian who is trained in the 18th century, to know about this particular exchange.
Now, earlier you mentioned that Cappon felt a sense of urgency and was a driving force behind the publication of this series of correspondence. Would you tell us why he was keen on seeing all the correspondence that John and Abigail Adams and Thomas Jefferson wrote and sent to each other published in a single volume?
I think there was a strong sense that this was a distinctive correspondence. I've just read the review in the New York Times of these volumes, these beautiful 2 volumes of the Adams-Jefferson Letters when they were published. And the reviewer, who was himself a scholar of Thomas Jefferson, Dumas Malone, wrote about how this is one of the most extraordinary correspondences in what we understand as the founding period of American history. He described this correspondence as one friend to another and talked about how Cappon was really the right person to do this. The reviewer described him as a perceptive and sympathetic editor. And also, even in this long review, Malone said, I've been unable to do full justice to these volumes because of what he described as these matchless letters. And Malone concluded this review by saying, being wholly in the open now, they belong to all of us, and we may be justly proud of this rich heritage. I think what he's getting at there is that, some of us are now used to on the internet being able to go online and see the text of some of these wonderful materials now that some of these documentary editing projects have put their work online. But when this was published and when Cappon was first working on this, the only way to get this information out to a wider public was to publish in what we now call a letterpress edition, but to publish in a volume, in a physical book. And this Adams-Jefferson Letters, what the reviewer Malone is calling these matchless letters, this rich heritage, then appeared in libraries all over the country and around the world. This set is actually the Omohundro Institute's best-selling publication of all time, because I think people continue to see these letters as particularly evocative and revealing of the founding period of the United States.
Now, in that review you just read us by Dumas Malone, Malone wrote that Cappon brought humanity and sympathy to his editorial work. How did Cappon do that precisely? How exactly does a historian bring humanity and sympathy to someone else's letters?
That's a really great question. Can I answer that by talking a little bit about Cappon's view of archives and history? He's really an interesting guy who was a historian. He was a PhD historian from Harvard. He got his PhD in 1928. But he then went on to be not only a history professor, but also the director of multiple archives. He also helped to create the special collections at the University of Virginia Library by traveling around Virginia, really in hot pursuit. I like to think of him as in hot pursuit in the 1930s and 1940s of what he'd heard of as existing historical manuscript collections. So he really understood the relationship between historical materials and what we can understand about the past. And of course, he was doing that by speaking with people who still had materials, maybe in county records or in small libraries, or even families that had materials. He was talking to people one-on-one about these materials and why they needed to be preserved and then shared in a particular way. And I think that sense of connecting the immediate present to that past is what made his work so important to him, and I think what still speaks to us. To your question directly about how do you convey humanity through editing a volume of letters, well, it might be the case that not every exchange of letters will leap off the page the way the Adams-Jefferson correspondence does. It surely does. These two men were brilliant writers, and I have to say that Abigail Adams' correspondence with Thomas Jefferson is also included in Cappon's work, and Abigail Adams' words just crack right off the page. She's a snappy writer and a snappy thinker. So there is something inherent to the writing of these letters that just pulls you in. But I do think that an editor can convey the humanity of their subjects in part by the choices they make, about the annotations that they make, about what information to highlight, about how they create sections, for example, within the volumes. Cappon did that. He created sections and almost chapters in this story of this correspondence. So, he didn't say, here is everything Thomas Jefferson ever wrote. Here is everything John Adams ever wrote. We could talk a little bit about how documentary editing projects actually do undertake to do that. Instead, he said, I want to put together this correspondence, which has these people writing to one another. It has this long history of a friendship in their correspondence. And you can really, when you read it, you can hear them talking to one another about what they're experiencing in the moment and reflecting on the extraordinary experience they had, kind of right there in the moment of the birth of the United States. And then later, as they see the United States developing, when they're writing in the early part of the 19th century to one another about what had happened. And we get that sense of back and forth because Cappon chooses to put them in conversation with one another. Adams to Jefferson, Jefferson to Adams, Adams to Jefferson. So to me, that's what brings the humanity kind of up off the page. The combination of their writing, Cappon's choice to put them in conversation with one another, which of course in their own mind they were.
You mentioned that Lester Cappon didn't just hand us a volume with everything that Thomas Jefferson and the Adamses ever wrote to each other, but that he actually made some editorial choices about which letters to include and which to leave out of his volume. Now, as someone who has edited the papers of someone else, would you tell us how a historian and editor decides which letters and documents they're going to include in their documentary editions and what they're going to leave out of them?
I think in this case, Cappon knew that he wanted to capture this really dynamic exchange that he felt was emblematic of the founding of the early United States. But, editors confront other kinds of historical manuscripts and make different kinds of choices about what to choose to print, to publish, and how to frame those pieces. For example, I edited with my colleague and friend, Susan Klepp, the diary of a woman named Hannah Callender. She lived in Philadelphia and she kept a diary between 1758 and 1788. It's an extraordinarily rich and reflective diary, and there aren't that many of women that we have. So just by virtue of her gender, this document is extraordinarily important. It's actually the manuscript version of it is at the American Philosophical Society. But we wanted to edit and publish it and share it because we thought it would be great for general interest readers. We thought it'd be great for more historians to have access to it. And because we really wanted to interpret that diary, there are large chunks of time when Hannah Callender was not writing. There were times when she wrote every single day for years, and times when there are years that went by that she didn't write at all. We think it's because she had small children and she was dealing with family illnesses, and there were other kinds of, life cycle issues that kept her from writing on a regular basis. So for us to interpret her diary, we actually wrote sort of interpretive chapters that are interspersed with the diary itself. Laurel Ulrich's really masterful edition of the diary of Martha Ballard, which doesn't reproduce the entire diary, but instead is more interpretive, more Laurel Ulrich and less Martha Ballard, is an interesting choice too. She reproduces a bunch of Martha Ballard's diary and then has these interspersed reflections. So there are different kinds of choices that a documentary editor can make that really convey their interpretation of the material. And sometimes those are obvious and sometimes they're not as obvious. Like maybe Cappon's choice to put these letters together might, if you pick up the volume, you think, well, of course you're going to put Thomas Jefferson and John Adams' correspondence in conversation with one another in a single volume. But that in itself is an interpretive choice. You look at the footnotes and you think, what did he choose to annotate? What did he think when he was working in the 1950s? What did he think were things that scholars and other readers wouldn't have known that they needed to know? That's an interpretive choice.
So our discussion about choices and the choices historians make raises some really interesting questions about historical sources. Is it true that historians and archivists often decide whether a particular historical source is worth preserving? And is it also true that what they see as a historical source worth preserving can change over time?
That's such a great question, Liz. So yes, they absolutely do. I think I may have said in one of our previous conversations on Ben Franklin's World that history, it's not a kitchen cabinet that you can open and simply peer into. And if you pick the right kitchen cabinet door, you'll see whichever piece of the historical past you're seeking. History is an interpretation of the past based on what's available to us and how we choose to interpret it. So what's available is the first key question. And we tend to have a lot of material from people who in the immediate aftermath of their lives or during their life themselves presumed were important. So their stuff was preserved. They created material during their life and it was preserved. So the case of Adams and Jefferson is a terrific one. They wrote a lot during their lives. They were fairly conscientious about collecting and preserving the material during their lifetime. And in subsequent generations, that material was then cataloged in libraries and made available to scholars. And then in the 20th century, there were large documentary editing projects that have worked to create these kind of specialized documentary editions. I was just looking at the history of the Papers of George Washington, for example, which, like some of these projects is ongoing. That the Papers of George Washington was a project begun in 1968 and has published dozens of volumes. The presidential series, for example, I think there are 10 volumes in the presidential series right now, and they're ongoing. the Revolutionary Year series are ongoing. These are big projects that take a lot of resources to undertake. But you can do that for someone like Washington because there's a lot of material in the first place. I saw that even in the project offices, they have copies of 135,000 documents. And those are just the ones they have copies of. So there was a lot of material to begin with. There was an interest in preserving it right away. There was cataloging over time. That's very important because if materials are kept, but they're not cataloged in a library, then no one really knows what's in there to find. And then lastly, there have been these projects which have worked to make them more widely available through books and then through online editions. So there are going to be groups of people for whom there isn't a lot of stuff available. I already mentioned because of the Hannah Calendar diary that we don't have a lot of texts from women, people who had less education, people who were not free, so enslaved people, people for whom written communication wasn't a priority, Native Americans, for example. So we're talking about text privileging a particular group of people and then the preservation of that text, yet another group of people. I think one of the things that's most interesting in the last maybe decade, surely there have been reflections before that, as we've talked about with Lester Cappon, but in the last decade, it's been a lot more focus and attention on the role of archives in preserving and making available historical materials. And in many ways, archives and special collections libraries just as responsible for, if not more responsible for, the production of historical knowledge as historians, that is, scholars who write from those materials. A lot of deep reflection about that lately, and a lot of, to my mind, really terrific engagement with scholars and archivists working together.
Earlier in our conversation, you mentioned that the Omohundro Institute decided early on that documentary editions were crucial to its mission to support high-quality historical research and to make that research widely available through publications. How does the OI go about producing these documentary volumes? When Lester Cappon came to the Institute and said, "I want to produce a documentary edition of the complete correspondence between John and Abigail Adams and Thomas Jefferson," what went on behind the scenes at the OI to make that work possible?
Another really great question. And it's interesting, to prepare for this conversation, I had asked for some material from the Institute archives, and that's how I found these wonderful press cuttings of the reviews of Cappon and so on. Cappon's case is slightly distinctive, actually, in terms of the Institute's support for documentary editing, in that Cappon was, at the time the book was published, he was the director of the Institute. So he was my predecessor several times over, but he was my predecessor as the director of the Institute. And actually, he held other positions. He was rather extraordinary here. He was the editor of the Journal, the William and Mary Quarterly. So he had multiple roles, which is one reason why his portrait hangs in our seminar room. So when Cappon wanted to do that project, he already had the Institute resources behind him, and he was able to draw on his experience as an archivist in gathering staff. So what's required for a documentary edition to happen for someone who's coming from outside the Institute is slightly different. And I'll use the example of the papers of John Marshall, which the Institute published in 12 volumes, edited by Charles Hobson, with support from a variety of different funding agencies, including some very nice grants from the Cromwell Foundation, but also the National Historic Preservation Records Commission, the NHPRC. So the first of those volumes was published in 1974. And then the final volume was published in 2006. So that tells you something about the time investment that these projects require. John Marshall, of course, was the fourth Chief Justice. He was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, most closely associated with bringing the Supreme Court into its preeminent role as a kind of co-equal branch of the federal government. And Marshall's papers, many of which are held actually here at William and Mary in the special collections at Swem Library, but others are elsewhere, first had to be gathered. So that's first, you need a staff that can go out and locate the materials. You need funding appropriate for a staff. I don't know how many people in total worked on the Marshall papers, but there were certainly maximum of half dozen at a time working with the primary editor, Charles Hobson, and others. And I think by the last volume, I think there were 3 people working on the final volume. But that requires a trained staff who can locate the items, do transcriptions of the item. So that means literally keying in from the 18th century or early 19th century text, keying that in into digitized text, or back in the day, it was a typewriter, which then went off on onion skin to be printed, and then to do the research for the annotations, and then to, of course, do the actual publication itself. So that's quite a lot of staff. I mean, the Papers of George Washington project, for example, which I referenced before, now has a dozen staff members working on that project. And you can see there are other large projects, the Adams papers and the papers of Thomas Jefferson, but there are other big projects too, not all focused on so-called founding fathers, which have major staffs associated with them. It's a major commitment of resources, both, money and people and skill, frankly.
Yeah, wow. It sounds like these volumes take a lot of years and a lot of people to produce. So how exactly does an organization like the Omohundro Institute go about getting, at least the financial resources it needs to support and produce these volumes?
It sort of depends on whether we're talking about a kind of one volume piece or we're talking about a multi-volume project. So when I referenced, for example, the Institute's first, what I would call edition, so I'm talking about editions of primary texts, right? So these are early American texts, which we are then producing in modern editions. The first one was The History and Present State of Virginia by Robert Beverly, edited by Louis B. Wright and published in 1947. We actually published a new edition in 2013 with an introduction by Susan Scott Parrish. So that's a single volume item. Beverly actually published The History and Present State of Virginia in London in 1705. That was a volume. It had 18th century text. It had to all be transcribed, of course, and there's annotation and there's material around it. But, that's the work of an editor who's producing his manuscript from the original source. And then, of course, there is the typical staff that we have here who work on all kinds of books, books that scholars are producing and so on. So that's a manuscript editor, a substantive editor, and then, of course, fact checking and verification. So that's one kind of documentary project. It requires slightly more and different kind of attention from the manuscript editors here at the OI, as well as the documentary editor. But that's really different from something like the Papers of John Marshall, which is a long multi-year project. And that really does require going outside for extra resources. And there are grant-making agencies that have funded these projects. So the NHPRC, which I've just mentioned, is a just historically very important resource for all kinds of documentary projects on all kinds of subjects. They supported the Founding Fathers projects, but they've also supported all kinds of other kinds of documentary editing, making these really important historical texts available to Americans and, of course, people around the world. Going out and getting those grants means writing a grant application and competing through the grant funding process. We were fortunate that Chuck Hobson, the editor, was very good at working with foundations and very skilled at writing grants and getting grants to support his staff, and then to support the work that it would take to produce the books themselves here. So foundations are a really important part of this public financing through like the NEH and the NHPRC, but also private foundation funding. And in the case, as I said, of the Marshall Papers, the Cromwell Foundation, which is dedicated to legal history.
Robert Beverly's The History and Present State of Virginia, the Adams-Jefferson Letters, the John Marshall Papers. Has the Omohundro Institute been involved in any other documentary editing projects?
The Institute, since that first volume in 1947 and up to a wonderful edition of the Dividing Line Histories of William Byrd of Westover in 2013, the Institute has published a total of 26 different projects, and that's counting the Marshall Papers as one project. I guess another notable one that I would mention would be the papers of the Carroll family, edited by Ronald Hoffman, who was my immediate predecessor as director of the Institute. You can see that there's a strong strain here of Institute directors who are interested in doing documentary editing work. But Ron Hoffman and Sally Mason edited in 3 volumes the papers of Charles Carroll, who was the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence, and his family were very important in the founding of Maryland. Those 3 volumes were published in 2001, and they're actually working on additional volumes even as we speak.
Karin, if you had to guess, what do you think the impact of all the OI's different documentary editions have been, in terms of the production of the history books that we love to read and to our overall knowledge about early American history?
I think they're essential. I think they're absolutely essential. And I think that having, as we do, a wonderful book series, which has combined both the historical monographs that have really shaped this field, everything from Winthrop Jordan's White Over Black and Gordon Wood's Creation of the American Republic, Kathy Brown's Good Wives, Nasty Wenches and Anxious Patriarchs, up to this beautiful book that just landed on my desk that is hot off the press, Susan Sleeper Smith's Indigenous Prosperity and American Conquest, about Native women in the Midwest. In combination with these documentary editions, I think just shows us the breadth of kinds of historical work and the breadth of engagement that scholars have with the past. I think the documentary editions in particular are able to serve an incredibly wide readership. They make these historical materials of the past more accessible to more scholars who need them for the work they're doing, but also a good documentary edition, as this wonderful one, the Adams-Jefferson Letters does, is really opens up the past to any reader. I can't imagine anyone sitting down, opening the volume of these letters and not being captivated by this exchange between Adams and Jefferson. It's really just a remarkable window into a particular moment in time. And it's true that I'm kind of a history nerd, and it is true that I will always think people are going to be engaged by the past. But I think that what documentary editions can do is bring the past right to your desk, right to your handheld device, right to your bookshelves. And that's quite powerful.
Now, is there a place that we can go to learn more about documentary editions, the Omohundro Institute's work with them, and perhaps even pose and seek answers to any questions we may have?
Sure. You can always check us out on our website at omohundro.institute, or you can send me an email. I'm always happy to talk with people about the Omohundro Institute and its work and how we can bring the past to you. And for information about these documentary editions, I would say on our website, we have a whole section about our books, and there's information there about the Cappon book. There's information there about some of the other documentary editions that I've mentioned, and even a year-by-year account of what we've published. It's really kind of good reading, I think.
Karin Wulf, thank you for taking us behind the scenes of how documentary editions are produced, and specifically for how the Omohundro Institute helped produce Lester Cappon's The Adams-Jefferson Letters.
Thanks so much, Liz.
Since 1943, the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture has been dedicated to supporting expert research and publication in the field of early American history. One of the many ways it carries out this mission is by supporting the publication of documentary editions, like Lester Cappon's The Adams-Jefferson Letters. Now, as Karin revealed, it takes a lot of work and expertise to produce a documentary edition. A documentary editor needs skills in both the fields of history and archives, because they need to be able to track down and locate the materials they want to publish, and then they need to be able to prepare those materials to be published. Preparing the material to be published requires a lot of editorial decisions. Documentary editors need to decide which material to publish, how to organize those documents for readers, what information within those documents needs additional context so that readers can follow along. Then, once all that editorial work is done, they'll need to enter the publication process, which means a lot of copy editing and fact-checking. Now, collectively, this is time-consuming work. Just look at Lester Cappon's volume. The Omohundro Institute began its work on the Adams-Jefferson Letters in 1948, and it took Lester Cappon until 1959 to see it in print. It took 11 years to collect the letters and then to organize, annotate, and prepare them for publication. Plus, it also took time to publish them. But good work takes time to produce, and the Omohundro Institute knows that. The OI stands committed to seeing work like Cappon's done, because they know that a really good documentary edition serves an incredibly wide readership. These editions open up the past for all of us. They give us an idea of who past people were as people, why they thought and acted the way they did, and why events from the past turned out the way they did. They do all of this while also offering us a real-time front-row view to all the events they cover. Documentary editions connect us to the world of vast early America like few other books, which is why we love to read them, why historians love to research with them, and why the Omohundro Institute will continue to help scholars produce them. Okay, so that's our tour, and I hope you really enjoyed it. If you have any questions about documentary editions or the work of the OI, please don't hesitate to send me an email, liz@benfranklinsworld.com, or you can contact Karin. You'll find Karin's information on the Omohundro Institute website at omohundro.institute. Now, I have to say, I really enjoy getting to know more about documentary editions and about the work of the OI. I mean, our tour was really like a behind-the-scenes look at history and how we produce it. So I think this may be something we do more of from time to time. Take these behind-the-scenes tours. Because I'm still kind of new at the Institute, and I work with a lot of great people who seem to have really interesting jobs that we really should know more about. Because these are the people who make the work of history possible and better. So what do you think we should tour next? The worlds of editing and fact-checking? The process of journal or book publication? I'm really open to ideas here, so send them to me. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.
Are you interested in the parts of history that remain a mystery? Do you want to learn more about the historical myths and misconceptions used to prop up false belief today? I'm Nathaniel Lloyd. In my podcast, Historical Blindness, I delve into all of these topics, sharing puzzling tales from the past and examining hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and misremembered events that provide insight into modern politics and religion. New episodes every 2 weeks. Find Historical Blindness on most podcast players and platforms.
As a longtime foreign correspondent, I've worked in lots of places, but nowhere as important to the world as China. I'm Jane Perlez, former Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times. In our third season of Face Off, the US versus China, we'll explore some of the biggest issues dividing these global powers today. Trump and Xi Jinping, AI, China's growing military might, and also robots. New episodes of Face Off are available now, wherever you get your podcasts.